And welcome back, once again, to Chapter 4 of this beginner's guide for Fire Emblem 6 on hard mode. This chapter marks the very first true test of your skills. You'll face a storm of incoming cavaliers with very high stats, and they are backed up by a new terrifying enemy, nomads. On hard mode, these guys are incredibly difficult to deal with. They are accurate, they double most of your units, and they are incredibly hard to hit. On top of that, probably due to a programming oversight, nomads are not treated as cavalry for the purpose of effective damage, meaning weapons like the rapier and halberds won't do anything to them. They are also fast enough to avoid being doubled by Marcus, and they usually have just enough hit points and defense not to get killed by his silver lance. Your success in Chapter 4 will depend on how quickly you're able to deal with the enemy nomads before the next wave of enemies can come rushing in at you. Before we talk about the initial layout of the map, let's take a look at the side objectives and reinforcements, as there is a lot going on here. The village to the northeast gives you a door key. There's no need to rush this one. The northwestern village gives you a steel blade. This item is the big meme, and you probably shouldn't worry about getting it, although I suppose you can sell it for gold. The southern village, however, gives you an Angelic Robe, and this is one of the most important items you'll get in the early game. From turn 4, 6, 8, and 10, 2 pirates will spawn from the sea forts in the southeast. One with an iron axe, another with a hand axe. They will head towards the villages, but will stop to attack anyone that gets in their range. If they are not impeded in any way, the first pirate will reach the southern village on turn 9, depriving you of that Angelic Robe. Right next to the southern village is an armory that sells iron and slim weapons, as well as javelins and hand axes. Next to it is a vendor that sells fire tomes, heal staves, and vulneraries. On turn 3, Clarine will show up from the castle as a green unit and move towards Roy. She will recruit herself if given the chance. On turn 6, Rutger will come out together with 2 fighters and an archer. Lastly, on turn 11, a group of 5 cavaliers will spawn from the easts. However, they will not show up if the boss of the chapter is killed. The same goes for Rutger actually, but if you manage to kill the boss before turn 6, you probably don't need to watch this guide. The initial layout of this map gives you the impression that you should hold the bridges, as they are good choke points, and the river acts like a natural barrier against the enemy cavalry. However, while this approach may have worked fine on normal mode, I find that it tends to make things more difficult on hard mode. The cavaliers are so unbelievably bulky that it takes forever to kill them if you can only attack them from one square. And at some point, the second wave of enemies will arrive to reinforce the first. And when there are multiple nomads running around sniping you from across the river, there's only a matter of time before one of your units gets picked off. Even if you do manage to survive, chances are pretty high that the pirates are going to reach the southern village and deprive you of an Angelic Robe. Instead of hunkering down behind the river, my approach for this map is to cross it immediately and play hyper-aggressive, attempting to rout the incoming wave of enemies before the next one can arrive. All in all, there will be 3 waves you need to deal with. The initial one consisting of 2 cavaliers and a nomad, then a second wave consisting of 3 cavaliers and a nomad, and then lastly you have to deal with whatever units are left around the castle as well as Rutger's squad. At some point the pirates will also arrive from the east, but they shouldn't really be much of a problem. I recommend you begin this map by ensuring Marcus has a fresh stack of javelins and a full vulnerary in his inventory, and then place him in a position where he will retaliate on all the incoming enemies. There is a lone cavalier to the north that I allow Roy to handle with his rapier and some backup damage from Lou. The rest of the squad I move in as close as possible to the enemies but without putting them in range. I like to send Shanna down towards the southern village immediately to ensure I get the Angelic Robe before the pirates become a problem. The first enemy phase sees Marcus handling the incoming cavaliers and the nomad. He's not guaranteed to land all his javelin hits here, but the most important thing for him to do is to hit the nomad on the counterattack. This will bring it low enough to get picked off for the next turn, and I find that this is absolutely required to survive the second wave. Now, do you remember how I said I had a love-hate relationship with Fire Emblem 6's halberd in the previous episode? Well, this is why. The halberd offers you around a 50-50 shot at instantly killing a cavalier with either Lot or Wade, which is incredibly valuable since they don't tend to do much else in this chapter. But if you miss that shot, it's going to put one of them in serious danger, as they often get doubled due to the halberd's heavy weight. I am actually able to land my hit here with Lot, and this makes everything much easier. I then use Ellen to trade the halberd over so I can give it to Wade during the same turn, and also give Marcus some much needed healing in the process. Marcus then takes out the weakened nomad, which leaves only a single cavalier left to deal with. To be fair, the halberd trading trick can be a cute gimmick, and I just wanted to show it off as it might come in handy for future chapters, but the truth is that I didn't really need to do this, as I had plenty of damage to kill the remaining cavalier. And in fact, because Wade ends up missing, it actually puts me in a more precarious situation, as I have to rescue him out of there so D can finish the job. You can also see here why FE6's Armor Slayer is incredibly valuable. It has such great stats stats on it that it is sometimes preferable to use even against non-armored opponents. For the next wave of enemies, you will be taking on a Nomad and 3 Cavaliers. This is usually more than you can safely handle in a single turn. You can of course resort to the Halberd again, but if that fails, it is most likely a reset. So for this wave, I like to pull off a strategy that I simply call the Wall. To pull off this interesting maneuver, simply place your units in a formation where you ensure the weakest ones can only take a single hit from an enemy Cavalier. In order for this to work, you do need to take out the Nomad. And you also need to ensure that you don't damage any of the 3 Cavaliers to the point where they will die on the enemy phase and leave a spot open for one of their allies to move in and attack the same unit. At this point, the playable characters you have available that can survive more than a single hit are Marcus, Deke, Boris, and Lot. Everyone else tends to die in 2 hits unless you are really lucky. Now notice how I placed all my units in such a way that only Marcus can take 2 hits. Everyone else either has an ally next to them or is shielded by the terrain. Come the next enemy phase, barring a very unlucky low percentage critical hit, there is no way that any of these 3 Cavaliers are going to kill any of my units. Sometimes you have to resort to using the Wall during Fire Emblem 6's early game on hard mode. There are simply more enemies on the map that you can reliably deal with at this point. It's not a super exciting strategy, but it works. If all goes well and you successfully deal with the 2 first waves, all you have to worry about now is Rutger. But first, let's talk about Clarine. At this point, chances are she's already made it over to you. As I already mentioned, you cannot recruit Clarine. She will recruit herself. Let's take a look at her basics as a unit. Clarine is one of the most useful units in the entire game. She's a mounted healer with fantastic mobility, and her horse allows her to assist in rescuing and dropping units, which makes her very versatile. Clarine may start out a little frail, but her fantastic speed and luck growths will quickly make her one of your most elusive units. When promoted to Valkyrie later on, Clarine becomes a very useful combat unit that can double pretty much everything, and she will be practically impossible to hit when using either defensive terrain or an avoid boosting support. Clarine is a staple unit on pretty much every team. There's almost never a reason not to field her. You should try to have her heal something every turn, even if it's just a single point of HP. You want her to get as much experience as possible. Clarine starts out very useful and will just continue to become better as the game progresses. Use her as much as possible. We are not quite done talking about Clarine though. Before we continue with the map, there is something important we have to mention. Even after she is recruited into your army, the enemies of Chapter 4 will continue to ignore Clarine, even if she is in their way. This means that you can actually use her to protect your other units, which is kind of funny because this is quite literally the opposite of what she wants. There are 3 notable exceptions to this rule though. The boss of this chapter will still attack her if she comes within his range. The pirates will also attack her, but only after every single village on the map is either visited or destroyed. The cavalier reinforcements that spawn on turn 11 will also attack Clarine if she is within their range, and they won't prioritize her last like the pirates do, so be careful. This unique AI is only present on this chapter, so enjoy it while it lasts. From the next chapter and onwards, you will need to be careful with Clarine again. Next up, we have to deal with Rutger's squad, which comes out of the castle on turn 6. This is always a nightmare for newer players since Rutger charges straight at you the same turn he spawns. It is therefore important to memorize the safe zone around his spawn location. This is Rutger's range. A nice little key thing to remember is that as long as your units are to the right of this village, they won't ever be close enough for him to attack them. Rutger himself isn't everything you need to worry about, however. You also need to be wary of the fighter and the archer above him, though they are not as dangerous as Rutger with his killing edge, so you can safely place a tanky unit like Marcus, Deke, or even Boris in their range and be absolutely fine. It is very likely that several enemies will still be hanging around the turn Rutger spawns, so once again you need to set up your units in a wall formation. This time, however, you have Clarine to help you out, as she can shield one of your units from harm, and also place herself right in Rutger's range so she can recruit him immediately the turn he comes out. There shouldn't be any nomads left at this point, but if there are, make sure you prioritize killing them, or else your wall formation will simply fail. If you survived Rutger and his squad, you can now go ahead and recruit him with Clarine, and congratulations, you just got the best unit in the game. Rutger is an absolute beast. On hard mode, certain recruitable enemies gets a boost to their stats, which is why Rutger's bases are notably higher here than on normal mode. Due to the random nature of these boosts, Rutger's stats can fluctuate a little, but it's not something you need worry yourself over.
Rutger's ability to kill things is unrivaled in this game. Armed with his killing edge, he can take down most hard mode enemies from full health in a single round of combat, which is something even Marcus and Deke start struggling with in Chapter 4. Not only is Rutger amazing when you get him, but he will just continue to improve thanks to his solid growth rates. When he later promotes to a Swordmaster, he will get an insane 30% boost to his critical rate, and will be able to kill pretty much everything you throw him up against. Rutger is also one of the best boss killers in the game, and that is very useful considering how tough they get later on. In addition to being good at killing things, Rutger is also surprisingly durable for a Myrmidon. He has really good avoidance thanks to his high speed, and even when he takes an unlucky hit, he is usually able to shrug it off just fine. It's not an understatement to say that Rutger is one of the strongest units in the game. Use him as much as you can. He will be your absolute savior on hard mode.
With Rutger now on your side, you should have no issues cleaning up the remaining enemies. You will most likely start to encounter pirates at this point, and they are a nice source of experience for your units. I prefer to send both my cavaliers equipped with swords, as well as Deke and Chad to help out. Clarine can also tag along to provide some healing, as the pirates might still be ignoring her. When attacking them, focus on the ones wielding hand axes, as the other ones with iron axes will get themselves killed on enemy phase. I like to take my time and route all of them, as it usually gives at least one level to each of my cavaliers, which is very nice at this point. Around this moment, Shanna should have already reached the bottom village and picked up the Angelic Robe. This is a very important stat booster as it can completely change the viability of certain units, so let's go over everyone that could potentially benefit from this item. The first and most obvious choice for this robe is Roy. As annoying as it is, you will be forced to put up with his antics for the entire game, and this Angelic Robe basically ensures he takes an extra hit on the front lines, which can be incredibly useful. It makes him less likely to get one-shotted by certain bolting mages in the mid-game too, and overall it'll just reduce the headaches you'll incur trying to keep him alive. Alan and Lance are also both great choices for this robe. Each of them will be on the front lines constantly and take tons of hits. Another option to consider is also Lou. His low HP and defense puts him in range of getting one-shot by a lot of enemies of the early game, which limits his usefulness. Even if his avoidance is good and enemies have a very low percentage chance to hit him, he is not reliably going to dodge tank if the first unlucky hit takes him out and forces you to reset. Giving the robe to Lou makes him so much better at tackling threats on enemy phase, so do this if you intend for him to be one of your main offensive units. Clarine is also an alternative, as she too tends to get one-shot by a lot of enemies, and this robe will ensure that she can usually take 2 hits before dying rather than 1. I'm not a big fan of this option, as your healer shouldn't be placed in enemy range to begin with, but it will undoubtedly make her a much better Valkyrie in the late game, if that is your plan. Shanna is also a good choice for the robe if you plan on using her for the long haul. It won't make her survive arrows, but it might make her take an extra hit or two, and that will make her infinitely more useful in the mid-game. I'm not a big fan of this choice personally, but if Shanna is going to be one of your main flyers, it's something to consider. Lastly, I've heard people who enjoy giving this robe to Rutger, the argument being that he is going to be one of your main powerhouses, and thus getting his durability boosted is going to make him even better at doing his job. I disagree with this, because Rutger's base survivability is already so high that a robe isn't going to remarkably improve his role. Still, if you want to go balls to the walls with Rutger, be my guest, but I think there are other units in your army that benefits far more from this Angelic Robe. With all of these choices in mind, I decide to give my robe to Roy, as this is something that will always be useful no matter what happens, but you should really just give the robe to whoever you want. After getting the robe, you should make sure you visit both the top villages at some point for the door key and the steel blade. It is also imperative that you remember to visit the armory. This is the first armory that sells hand axes, and you won't be able to visit another one until the middle of chapter 7. I personally recommend that you get at least 5 of these, and possibly 2 to 3 extra javelins, depending on how frequently you've used them. I also like to pick up a slim lance, as sometimes the extra accuracy can be very nice against a unit that's almost dead, but still kinda hard to hit. You should also visit the vendor and pick up a couple of heal staves, as you're going to burn through a lot of these with both Ellen and Clarine constantly healing. If you're planning on using Lou frequently, you should also pick up another fire tome. Once you've done everything there is to do on this map, one final challenge looms ahead. The boss of this chapter, Erik. He is going to be one of your toughest challenges yet. Being a cavalier, all of his stats are really high across the board, and he's also the first boss to carry multiple weapon types, a steel sword and a javelin. This makes him hard to weapon triangle, and he will also swap his weapons around to weapon triangle you. Fighting Erik will depend on your ability to manipulate him into wielding the weapon you want and then attacking him accordingly. There are multiple approaches you can take. The first one is to use Roy's rapier. Since Erik starts out with a steel sword by default, Roy can actually fight him pretty well. He will have around 70% accuracy and do around 10 damage. As long as you rescue Roy out of there with a mounted unit and heal him up in between attempts, this is a good way to go about it, and also gets Roy some experience to boot. While you are doing this, Luke can help out a little bit with his fire tome, but unless you gave him the Angelic Robe from earlier, he too will probably need to get rescued out of there, as Erik's javelins are likely to one-shot him. Sometimes they won't, however, but without the robe, this is subject to the whims of the RNG. Another option is to use Old Reliable, Marcus with his trusty Silver Lance. This option certainly works, but at this point your Silver Lance durability is probably starting to run a little low, and you want to conserve it a little for the maps to come. If you manipulate Erik into wielding a javelin, you could also have a go at the halberd, but even with weapon triangle advantage, your accuracy will be very shaky. If you actually manage to land a hit, you will take quite a chunk out of Erik's health, but you will also sadly have to deal with Erik having a small chance to crit you back. I did mention earlier that Rutger is a pretty good boss killer, and that is mostly true, but sadly Rutger also faces a little bit of crit from Erik, and this isn't a risk most players are willing to take this late into the map. I suggest you go with either the Roy or the Marcus approach. As for who gets the boss kill, that's really up to who you want to use at this point, but I'm just going to do the basic thing and give it to Roy, as the extra stats can be quite helpful in the chapters to come. And with Erik out of the way, you can successfully seize the throne, and congratulations, you have just beaten one of the harder chapters in Fire Emblem 6 on hard mode. Next up, things are going to slow down a little bit, though there are certainly aspects to the upcoming chapter that can seem a bit hectic to newer players. But don't worry, I'm going to teach you how to safely go through it. Until that time comes, remember to leave a like and a comment if this guide helped you out, and I will see you again very soon. Bye bye!